Hi guys, thank you so much for joining us for this week's OG Rose conversation. I am so excited, honored, delighted to have Jorge Rivera with me. He's an artist, and we are going to be talking today about his presentation and just generally about like his work, his ideas, and how it's like the philosophy behind art, but also for the Science of Logic conference, which was hosted by Cadell Last's Philosophy Portal. Jorge did an incredible presentation about self-reflections in the creative. And I just thought it was an incredible presentation. And so I'm really excited to just sort of jump in, dive into this topic and, learn a little bit more about you. I'm excited for everybody to be introduced to you and your work and be able to check out your website. We'll have all of that information in the description to this video. But anyways, I'm so happy. Thank you so much for your time in advance, Jorge, and for being with me today.
Thanks, Michelle, for that beautiful, beautiful presentation. Well, I don't know if it was amazing. I tried my best to try and kind of like follow up a little bit of Hegelian science of logic, which I'm still sort of like, I don't pretend to, I just kind of like stumble upon concepts and make sense of them as the best way I can, and the way I see them relating to myself and relating to my practice as an artist. And my knowledge of Hegel was obviously to the PhD. I had to sort of like understand the basics of dialectical process and like sort of like the basis. But it was through the course of Cadell that I had the chance to actually go deep into this amazing text, and it's so dense and so rich that it kind of like made me think things through again and come up with new ways of talking about the whole, kind of like more or less like revisiting my old PhD and get a different perspective of it. Not so much in the sense of making it more theoretical, but perhaps a bit more poetic. Using some of the concepts that I could more or less relate to concepts such as inner shine or sublation, or so many that I could just you can kind of like get these concepts and start developing them. I think there is something very creative and about writing as well, which it's the same thing. I don't pretend to be a writer or anything like that. I'm really an artist. I'm a sculptor and a painter, and like to mess around with filmmaking, but I'm not a filmmaker either. But I think when it comes to writing, for me, the only way to be able to do something which is meaningful, I have to go always to my own experience as a sculptor, and kind of like open up a poetic dimension, which kind of like reverberates with a lot of these concepts, and as I'm trying to make sense of them, basically. That's really what it is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I loved something that I saw in your presentation where you talked about sculpture as pathological. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm remembering correctly, sculpture as pathological, film as mythical, and then I think it was writing as logical. Yeah.
Yes.
Where those are yeah. And I thought those are really great categories for those practices. And it made me think about obviously there can be something very troubling and something that needs to be worked through and resolved for the person who has like pathologies, right? Like pathological things are not necessarily good, and we don't want to necessarily keep being, let's just say a pathological liar or whatever. But there is something about the fact that when I think about the word pathology, it makes me think about the fact that we are all on some sort of path. We have all certain habits and things over so many years that we are sort of pathological about in just the way that we function. But I really loved how it's a sort of self-admittance that doing sculpture is pathological. I just love that so much. And then yeah. Comment on that for me, Jorge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see. I mean, I always go to other artists to kind of like that they like to explore. They like to use artists as a way to deal with their own traumas. Like you have Louise Bourgeois, for example, that even when she just like who was very, very old, before dying, she was still breaking sculptures and going like, going through some traumas of her childhood. And she had this great show at the Tate in London many years ago with the big spiders, and it was really, really beautiful. And you could see a video of her just like crushing things and getting very angry. It was completely in a sort of like a very, she was not there when she was breaking and shattering all of those things. And but it was very compelling to see, and it was kind of like life. It was really captured the moment where she was just like breaking her own sculptures and like swearing and French mixing with English so all together. And but at the same time, she's a very sweet old lady, so seeing her going through all of those sort of like traumas in her mind, like they're still kind of like a dream, it's like recalling all of these memories. And the same way, like I think for me, at least in my experience, you are constantly playing with the interiority of your body, of your emotions.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's what I try to do with the whole project. I try to open up the project to, when I did it, that's why I decided to use film. Because the making of a sculpture, when you go and see a show of a sculpture, you see the finished pieces, right? There's whole beautiful big bronze, you see, or painting or whatever, you always see the finished things. And the thing with the sculpture, it becomes so much of an identity, like an object, a thing that was totally finished and very polished. But the beauty of it is really the process, how to make it, and more than anything else is like the inner journey that in painting happens everywhere. So I think in that respect, especially that's why the whole thing about reflection, there are some big moments in the practice when this connection, let's just say, between the inner world becomes very, or within your inner world becomes very, very strong. And one kind of like starts inflating like a balloon. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like it gets processes so much energy from within, and that is about to burst. And that's why I like to, like some people say, okay, this is all, this is like this is I don't know, like all of this, there's a lot of technical concept being in the flow, all of those things. I think for me, because of when I was doing the PhD, this language was really only reserved for sort of like sports maybe, and you couldn't use that type of language. So and for me it was like, okay, I'm becoming self-reflective. I am really becoming self-reflective at this very point in time, which means I see myself, I reveal something bigger than me, but is still me, reveals itself to me in the object that I'm making. So, and it's through that interaction with the subject and the object that this sort of like phenomena takes place. For that, obviously, you have to really kind of like connect very deeply with the materials that you're working with, and you have to allow the materials to suggest you where they want to go. So, you become a bit like a vessel. And then the sculpture itself is a vessel as well, especially if you work with clay as the first stage of a bronze casting. So yeah, for sure, there is this reflection from what you're making and yourself. That is, you kind of like, it's like a reverie. You're dreaming, you're recalling things from the past, you're projecting things about the future, you're trying to be in the moment, and sometimes you really are in the moment. And those moments are, for me, unsustainable. There is a moment where it kind of like bursts, and you just have to let go of it. And because the emotion is so deep and so strong, sometimes that is overwhelming. Yeah. So and that's why perhaps the whole thing about being inspired or inspiration is that you can only for so long inhale, like breathe in before you have to let go. So I think maybe that's part of it, for inspiration and the whole becoming so reflective. And yeah, that's the whole, that's basically how I see pathology. I'm not really trying to project all my traumas into it. This is not my whole philosophy. In the work, I'm more trying to, this idea of become self-reflective and try to communicate the best way I can these moments. So yeah. in this particular video was a project in the skin of the bull and sort of reflection on the creative process of broadcasting. It was through it was through, you know, like articulating that. The pathos was the sculpture making. The mythos was really the filming, the narrative. The narrative takes over. You create your own narrative because you have the outer journey, which is the documentation of the making of the piece, and the inner journey, which is, you know, all these reveries that they were sort of like performance actions that I intercut with the sort of like actual making, with the documentation. And then obviously the logos comes later. You know, you become so reflective, but then you can reflect upon what you've done only later through the writing. The writing is what really helped me to articulate the whole thing, but it came later.
Is that, thank you so much for that, Jorge. That was all incredible, and I have lots of thoughts that came to mind. I was thinking with your thesis. So you did all of the making, the filmmaking, and then you wrote your thesis like later, because you know all of it probably had to be presented for, you know, for your thesis. So was that like the kind of the timeline of like, okay, I'm gonna do the physical like embodiment of it all, then I'm going to, you know, I'm curious with the film, because you know you also have to like work on your film and edit your film a bit and stuff like that. And then was that the order of how you did things?
Yes, actually, to be honest, the whole idea of making a film was for me to try and avoid a lot of the writing, if that makes sense. Really trying to articulate a lot of things is through the visual, but then it really became a work of art. It really became a work of art, and then it's like, okay, you really have to, you know, unfold it further, like much further. Otherwise, it's just a project, an artistic project per se. So so I had to kind of like delve much deeper into the whole sort of like academic format, and it was through the writing. And it was like that. Actually, I didn't plan it. The whole thing was really organic. I didn't plan about making a film. I was just working with film. I was making films, and I was the whole project at the beginning was reenacting Narcissus. You know, I was looking into whole Derrida, the reflection, and the idea of Narcissus and Echo. You know, the whole relationship between them, which I always found very beautiful. The fact that Narcissus trying to, you know, doesn't recognize himself as Narcissus until the point that he dies, and Echo is trying to touch him, but she has nobody to touch him. So the whole thing and the way he explains it is really beautiful, very poetic. So I was flirting with all of these ideas, and for me was only it was through interviews and through trying to open up what it is really what I'm trying to do with this whole research. What is it? And then, you know, I had an interview with a blind potter, and by then I was really into, you know, memoirs of the blind, Derrida, and reading a lot of Lacan as well, and you know, the whole making of molds and the mother mold, and you know, all of those things, and things kind of like start clicking in different ways, in a very organic way. And it was this interview with a blind potter that she kind of like I realized actually I had to go through my own blinding, you know, I have to become blind to the process. And then my whole sort of like identity started becoming quite important. You know, the fact of, you know, being abroad, having my own culture, you know, trying to explore my own culture, my own identity, the whole thing about, you know, Julia Kristeva. I was also reading a lot about abjection and how, you know, when you are abroad and you're you know in your own culture, the fact that I was also struggling with my English, you know, as well. So it was a whole thing, a whole process that it was really, and a lot of mistakes, you know, of lost in translation and trying to read very deep texts in English. And this was very, you know, this was like 2010, like it was the beginning of sort of like, you know, you had to go to the library and just take big books, you know, sort of this, and carry them with you and all of this, you know, and so the whole process was much slower, and even technologically. Now we are so used to the mobile phones, you know, you have we understand our image not anymore as a mirror image, but before the mobile phones, our understanding of our image was still the mirror image, which is not real. It's inverted. It's flipped over. So it's left to right, if that makes sense. But now with the phones, we can see, so we understand our bodies better. So technology is kind of like helping us to, I mean, I think maybe if this whole process or project would have been done nowadays, would have been faster. But by then was like, editing was an art. Making of a sculpture was really handcrafted, and the writing I had to do it on, so it was really a long, lengthy process, but it was not planned. It just kind of like organically grew into what it became at the end. And I think, not only for this project, but this is normally how I like to work. Yes, I just make things and a little by little I understand what it is the concept starts coming out from the practice, more than this is maybe something that I was trying to articulate, which I see perhaps a bit problematic within conceptual art nowadays, which is the fact that in conceptual art, you have an idea, you kind of like fall in love with the idea. It's a bit of a Kantian move because the idea becomes the thing, and the process of transformation, your sublation, you going through the process is not that important anymore, because the idea has to be materialized. So there is no room for the process. There's no room for reflect, like sublation or negation, or go through the problematics that the process kind of like pushes forward. And I think those problems are like, if you are open to that process, the piece might be extremely different to what you at the beginning thought you were going to be making. It's much more of a lengthy process, but I think it's if you put yourself into it, if you put yourself on the line, then you are talking about self-transformation and these moments of sort of reflection and reverie and all of these things can really take place. If not, you just have an idea and you just want to make it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing. I love a lot of conceptual art nowadays, and I have a lot of conceptual artists that are really good friends. But it's not how I operate. That's all. I kind of like appreciate other process. For me is very important.
Yeah. So that was really wonderful, Jorge. And I want to say that I have seen like excerpts of your film that you made as a process of your thesis as Skin of the Bull. And I loved it so much. It was such a visceral experience watching your film. It truly is its own art. Like the film itself is a piece of art. And you're also making art in the film, which is art. So it's extremely meta. There's so many meta levels to it. And I remember watching, like my kids were watching with me, and they just thought they were so fascinated, that there's so much that's very tactile about the film. And I can't, it's very difficult to describe it because there really isn't, the language is the mediums, and because there's not like really dialogue in the film, at least the portions that I watched on your website. Yes. But what's so incredible is that there is still a dialogue occurring in your own perception of what you're witnessing, and they're like it's very difficult to actually try to capture transformation in a genuine way that's not like forced. It's not it's very much like a earned type of transformation that is displayed in the film, and it's truly incredible, incredibly symbolic, incredibly raw. And I just I really enjoy your film very, very much. And I felt like it's interesting how silence then becomes its own kind of language to us when we are witnessing something happening, the process happening. Like there, it's not as if there was somebody kind of in the background, like you didn't narrate it, but there was still a narration occurring. And there's something very powerful about watching something in silence. And this used to be more of an art form, like silent films was actually a pretty significant art form in the past. We don't have that as much these days, and maybe it's because we are not as comfortable with silence. But it was truly beautiful and really powerful in its poignancy. And because of the silence, you could hear a lot of like your own breath. Like, there's a lot of effort especially in bronze casting. Like there's a lot of sweat, a lot of work that goes into it. It's not like, you gotta get ready to like work hard. And so it was neat to hear the actual breath and like the texture of like, hands, fingers touching clay and the paint and then, the balloons, like there's just all of these little sounds that's the language of the art and the medium that you miss out sometimes when maybe we're having like, here, place on the soundtrack, and here's the, and there's nothing wrong with those things. Those can make a very artful experience too. But it showed me the excess and absence, right? The absence of those things had an excess of the other dynamics at play. And so I just really had it was a very powerful experience watching your film, and I hope others will go and witness it as well. But I just wanted to speak to that because it's just really incredible, and it really, I could tell you poured your whole self into it. And that's the funny thing, right? Like bronze casting is a lot about, here's your mold, you're pouring in your materials, this is very heavy, you have to like, I mean, so I just kicked out my headphones. Hold on a second. I got excited. Breaking stuff. But like, you're actually pouring yourself into your art. And that's what's so interesting, is like this hyper meta level dimension of, you're making something, but really it's making you. And to kind of connect this back to the conceptual and like, conceptual art of today. I'm curious, and it's something I've been really fascinated with art for a long time, just as, my own kind of amateur sort of artist with, I love, like I'm a dancer primarily, so performative art, but then also visual art with like, especially charcoal drawing and ink drawing. But it's to me, I've always been really fascinated by the fact that the arts, if you just stumble upon the exhibition, right, the art, the show, the art's just there. And like you were saying, the film was so important to actually show the process, because what can be pathological about sculpture is like, there is my finished object, and it actually took a lot of time to get there, but you can just kind of see it total and complete. And we kind of expect that in our lives. Sometimes we just think it should be there, like it should just be made. We forget that we are the ones who are going to make it. It's not just going to necessarily show up for us and answer all of our hopes and dreams. Like we make the hope, and we are the hope that we seek sometimes. But anyways, there's something to me that's interesting, because, if you just stumble upon a gallery and you see the art there, I'm very, very curious as to like, is there any way, and maybe it doesn't really matter, because ultimately it's not so much about, what we could say, oh, this is what I got. Well, it is about that. It is about the audience engaging, because we've talked about this too, right? Like it's funny to just be a fly on the wall and see the audience actually engage with your art for the first time. That's what's so exciting to see, like, what does it conjure in them? What does it make them think? What does it make them feel? But there is something about the fact that there's this kind of very mysterious, and maybe it's in a humbling way, because we can never make it formulaic, like we could never really know. But there's a part of me that wonders, like, can you tell from the art itself if the person has actually gone through like a sublational process or not? You know what I'm saying? Because there's something about it, I'm like, I'm just curious, like, because then it's like, well, because if you can't really tell, then I can see people just being like, well, then what does it really matter to like go through that whole, facing negativity and all the hardship and all of that? Like, what does it matter? Because at the end of the day, you put the person who actually went through a sublational process, you put the person who didn't, they just had their idea and they're like, we're just going to do it and it's going to be like this. And you couldn't, the audience couldn't necessarily tell. But who can tell is the artists themselves. Like they know themselves and they know what they went through or didn't go through, or how much this sort of like challenged their ego or not to make that. So, but I'm curious about this, because art is so much thought of, or a lot of times art in the, if we think about institutionally, or just even just in the exhibition element of it, which is a big part of it, is like people will see it. And so ultimately, my big question comes from a book that I read called Modern Art and the Death of a Culture by Rookmacher. And I'm very interested in his thinking about this, because on the one hand, it's almost like, well, it's okay. Like, there's something really great we can get from the fact that everything kind of just jettisoned into like, art is not art, and all of this sort of like revolutionary movement of art and blah, blah, blah. But there's also something where it's like, wow, if you take like Rembrandt and you understand his whole way of engaging with the world and being able to depict that for people so they could actually get a sense of wonder themselves, then you get wonder on both sides of it, I suppose. Like even the person who's making a statement that there's no art, like the piece, like a canvas with the cut down the middle.
Yeah,
It's a famous piece, but I forget the title now. You know,
Mhm.
that will make you wonder as well. But like, is there a difference? It's a big question for me that I've had for many years of like, you know, basically, so I hope that makes sense. But to distill my question, because we cannot always tell, or do you think we can tell? Maybe that's the first thing. Do you think we can tell if a sublational process happened in making the art? And then two, if it doesn't matter, does it ultimately just come down to the artist saying it matters for me personally to go through a sublational process? Okay, I'll throw it your way.
I, I yes. I think there's always some. I mean, to a certain degree, there's always some sublation always taking place. Even in the super conceptual art world that they just wanna do this particular idea, they still have to go through the whole thing of contemplative people doing this, all of that. All the resistances will still be there. But I think perhaps in my case will be more of like a physical sort of like involvement into the whole thing, the whole process, like your tears and blood, everything goes there. The kind of like the whole thing becomes very physical. You breathe through your skin, and that was the whole thing about the film, trying to go through articulate the whole thing in looking into Rousseau's the Mystery of Picasso, kind of like hinting always towards that film. Not at all to do anything comparable to Picasso. Was kind of like trying to open up, because it was one of the kind of like cornerstone major films, first films that tried to show the artist at work, trying to articulate a process, which per se was never ending. It was a process which per se, you will see Picasso start making but then it gets to so many transformations. You see the camera from behind the canvas before, all these different angles. You can hear the voices of people talking to him. He talks as well at the same time. It's very beautiful. But then when you don't know, at the end, he starts with a circle, goes into an egg, into a chicken, whatever. And at the end, sort of like a goatee figure. And do you say, is this finished or not? And John Berger, who wrote, is one of the critics of, one of the main writers about it, he kind of said, well, there is something about Picasso when he's at work that kind of humbles himself to the point that the process completely, flows through it in the making. Later, maybe not. Maybe, it was about the persona of Picasso, whatever. But I think that's that ability to sort of like go through the process in a very sort of like reverential manner, that you're going to be transformed for whatever, the accidents, that's why the whole thing about Hegel is so relevant, especially this book to me, because it's the moments where the accidents do take place that you actually see, oh, wait, I was wrong, and you have to kind of remain very open, very porous to what is happening in the process, to accept those things, to accept those challenges. Whereas, in a pure conceptual art, those challenges are not in the actual making, but they are maybe somewhere else. They're like in the politics of the whole thing, trying to get that, which is also another type of problem, solving, the type of perhaps sublation. So I think, in that respect, everything is kind of like very open nowadays to, any type of art. Then it's a matter, I guess, of taste and how much of that really communicates with an audience. Like I had, for example, in the Skin of the Wool, I had a lot of people that went there, and it's like, I was actually, when I showed the film for the first time, I thought, okay, people will just go in and out, because, it's like very silent, very like you had a whole dark room with two entrances to go in. You could sit in the floor, and you could sit all around. It's kind of like a very big projection room. And it was a queue for people to go inside. Queue. And constantly, constantly. And I was really like touched because of that, and people was like, oh no. It really resonated with a lot of the audience. But then for other people was like too strong or too, too sexual to a certain degree, because the whole thing is kind of like it's a sublimation thing taking place going on there, because you go from the clay, which is kind of like pathological, the whole thing, into the three stages, which is like you play first with clay, then you make the molds, then it becomes wax, which the wax itself is a very sort of like candles. It's a very sacred, sort of like has a lot of sacred connotations. And then it goes into the bronze, which is the thing that is going to stay there forever.
Mm.
So those were the three stages that I sort of like related to the three stages of a bullfight. The first one is lances, where you see the guy with the horse, and the horse has to be blindfolded as well to be able to. So you have to enter the whole process of blindness, to go inside. So I think it's that sort of like necessity to go. The farther you go in the pathological, but even deeper than that, the pathological, I think, is just one layer of it. The more you are able to operate from within, the more truthful the work becomes, in a way, and then that's what it I think really connects with people. If you are able to do that, which, as I said, there are moments, there are brief moments,
Right.
or sometimes they're very long, or sometimes they might last, I don't know, days or weeks, or you are kind of like high without being able to sleep and just producing things non-stop for days. It really is something that can really transform you, but you have to be there. You have to, sometimes you are there and nothing happens, and you're just like that. If that makes sense. So is that availability, that sort of like, okay, I'm here. Let's do this. Let's be available. Yes. I guess that's all.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jorge. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And yeah, I think in many ways it's so, I wonder if it kind of just takes a reliance that, like, there's, like you said, there's going to be kind of like some sort of like sublational process regardless, right? And it might have less to do with the actual outcome. Not that that doesn't have any, significance, it does. But a lot of times it's so much about the unseen work, right? Like you could see the work, but now you can't. Now it's done, right? Like this is like, yes, that's the type of stuff that's going to be what ultimately creates the substance, right? Like it creates the sublational substance, the stuff that comes out of it and out from it. And so in that sense, like it's maybe less so about, again, like, okay, if we look at this art versus this art, do we see like some sublational process? Well, yeah, it just sort of, in a way, like the answer would kind of be like, well, it just sort of depends, right? Like it depends on how are you going to be able to engage with it? Because let's just say it was a conceptual artist and they said like, I'm going to do this idea, and I do wonder if today, because we have everything like very fast, we have the internet, we have, you can take pictures, you can just do it all so quickly that it makes it even more and more like tempting to avoid the long and the hard and the slow and the sweaty and the all of that process. It's just like, well, no, I can do it like a lot quicker over here. And I get that. Like I understand the sense of like needing to utilize conveniences and stuff like that. But it's also that, again, it may not matter. Like let's say that somebody did their project, really it was a conceptual art. They didn't really, they did it kind of quickly because it was easier to do it that way. And it didn't necessarily like change them a whole lot, but they really loved their idea and they did a good job with that. That art versus the person who kind of went through the grueling process, like how, I would describe like your work with Skin of the Bull. You could take either of those art, and perhaps we could never say, right? Like just not knowing the backstory, not knowing the artist, not knowing any of that. We couldn't necessarily tell, the difference per se, but that's kind of what I guess it makes me think of this humbling aspect of the unknown, where we can't really say, but at the end of the day, it's now we have a chance to kind of become a new sort of creator in how we take in what we experience and see. Yes. And really the value, not that it has nothing to do with the outcome, but in a way, the value is actually on the unseen development and cultivation of the artist in their own lives, right? And they have to be the ones to kind of live with those things themselves, and so we sort of just then leave it at that. And yeah, I think too, perhaps there's sort of there's something really fascinating, because going back to the thought of like technology and art and how that relationship is, it does make me think about the fact that, when photography came into being, then there's new kind of skills that like, I guess what I mean to say is that, you know, a lot of times people will be like, well, I'm more interested in maybe modern contemporary art or conceptual art because you can just take a picture of that, like that nature landscape, you could take a picture of that. So you don't really need to like have, you know, somebody getting really, really exceptional with their skills in oil painting to paint that seem maybe less like impressive. At the same time, though, it still is, and it's absolutely impressive because the fact that the person took time to do that, they took the time to be there, to witness, to behold, to be in the silence and solitude of their creation. It's still like absolutely impressive in a quite literal sense. It's like it makes an impression on them. They made an impression on the canvas, and we are made an impression on by witnessing that canvas. But I do think what could be the nice thing or the neat thing about technology is that it kind of then makes it about like, you know, you really then, if you are going to be the person doing the oil landscapes, you're doing it for, I don't want to say for no reason, but almost for no reason. And but that's the very fact of why it makes it so wonderful. And so much of why it matters is like, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, about doing stuff that doesn't matter or has no reason, but that's the very of why it matters, you know, because it's very difficult, I think. And I wanted to ask you about this because like personally, I can struggle with sometimes the fact of like, oh, you know, I've got some words in my head and I'm going to write a poem, and then just like, who cares? You know, like, why does this even, like, why would I even write this down? Like this, you know, where is it even going toward or what? And, you know, sure, we could get into like, well, yeah, I could collect them and release them and whatever. And maybe I will, maybe I should. But the thing is that it's very difficult, I think, sometimes as an artist to contend with the, why does this even matter? And so I guess what I mean to say is technology may allow us to be in a position where we're actually, it doesn't really matter, but that's why it can matter the most, because we're a human and because we have a drive or a fire, libidinal energy to make and to like, and it's like, I love that term you used in your project. I wanted to make sure I had it correctly. I think it was like non-negotiable sacrifice or something like that. It was like, that's where it's like, yeah. So there's this idea of like, it being the non-negotiable sacrifice, as in like, it's not like there's no way it's not going to happen, because it's going to happen. Like the balloon is going to pop, you know, like it's going to go. And so there's something about that position which is so inexplicable, because it's like, well, you don't really have to, and yet you have to. And that's the place of like the Hegelian tension of the AB, where it's this like not and it is, that is the dialectical of that I think is so powerful and is so, you know, is able to be so transformative in our lives and sublational in our lives, a springboard for that sublation. And I think, like, you know, perhaps if anything, perhaps technology will maybe make us have to sort of like choose it for ourselves, because there's no way we can say it's necessity. We don't need to do portraits anymore for the sake of the fact that we can't take a picture. We just do it for the love of it, for the fact that I can't not do this because it's in me and it has to come out, you know? Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing really quick about that, but I'll go back to my question. It's just, there is something incredibly, you know, there's a lot, like the libidinal energy reminds me a lot of the fact that like there's this conception, you know, this idea of like, you know, the whole sexual process is extremely like art, you know, and I think there's something really important about that, because then you know, really, if we think about Freud's term of sublimation, it's taking that libidinal energy and it's putting it towards something you're creating, and that's also changing and shaping you. But you know, I think of a lot about it as a mother, where it's like you're taking in the seed, you're cultivating the conception of the child, then you're birthing it through a lot of hardship of labor, but then it's like the joy is so immense you cannot even put it into words, you know, and but you live with that. Like it's not negotiable. It's not like you change that. Like, you will always be a mother, you know, and you'll always have your children no matter what happens. That is non-negotiable in terms of like, that's something that always would sit with me. It's like, oh, I'm expecting, this is non-negotiable. Like, the baby is going to need to come out into the world. I will have to do the birthing. I'm going to do this, have to be the one to, you know, Lord willing, be there to nurse the baby and, you know, care for the baby. And there's like this sort of strange, okay, like momentum, it's begun and it won't stop. You know, it's going to go until it is released into the world. And there's something quite powerful about that in that's why to me, like, every creator is a mother, because you know that like there's such an intimacy that you have, Jorge, with being a sculptor, a painter, an artist with the mothering process, because like you said, every sculpture to you is a baby, is a child, you know.
Yeah.
And this is like that's absolutely the reality of it. And so anyways, I'm really fascinated in that. But I want to go back to this question of this. Do you ever wrestle with the question of like, why does this even matter?
Yes, of course, of course. I think that's part of the whole is also Sublation in a way, but it's kind of like your own resistances as well to say, okay, how am I going to overcome this? Sometimes the difficulties are too hard. Maybe you don't have time. Maybe the openings are coming just around the corner. Maybe you just have to produce something like then and there. And then when the whole thing becomes a little bit more like that, for me, it loses a little bit of you just kind of like a bit of like making more of a product, just like, so. But that's why, even with your own works, you have favorite ones, you have things that that are good, that this is I put myself in this, like really this, and those ones I don't want to let go for some, because it's like they meant something really important to you, maybe through the processes of your life, or what the work can reveal to you in that moment. For many reasons, some works become, or maybe just, as we said, just an accident, maybe the way the paint kind of like tripped, or the lump of clay just like fell off or whatever, and then you decided to rescue it and put it there, and it looks wonderful. So all of those things can make a work very special. And then is that ability to really be there, and it's not even an ability, it's just, a lot of times it's just perseverance. It's just like you just have to force yourself to be there, to go to the studio, and just a lot of it is just problem solving, and just keep going in a very practical manner. But then obviously, in the whole kind of like sort of like a more conceptual sort of like framework, I think it's very important to go through the whole thing, so you don't become, you don't remain sort of like in the narcissistic thing of just what it is this world that needs from it, but you really go through the sort of like Orpheus thing, to go and to bring something meaningful from the other side. You really make that transfer. You go through the reflection to catch your loved object on the other side, which is inside of you. You just really bring something which is really meaningful to you. You don't even know what it is. As I said, you touch shapes, you touch forms, and you translate them into something else. And sometimes kind of like literally touches something inside of you which is really powerful, and it really kind of like moves you. And that, I think, has the ability to move also the viewer when it comes to see it. Not necessarily, but at least that you were there in that moment for real. You were not thinking about other things. You were there, and that moment was talking to you, and through you, that it's kind of like needs to be there. Let's just say it's a absolute knowledge sort of like moment where you don't know what this knowledge is. It has to be there. It has to be done. It's just kind of like, and it does it itself for you. You are not doing it. You're not, as you said before, you're not forcing it. It kind of like unveils itself in your hands, or something happens that boom, all of a sudden the whole thing collapses, crashes, and then you rescue something which is extremely beautiful out of it. And I think that's the whole thing, which I found really beautiful and I think for me, I mean, like everybody that has gone through a whole PhD process, they know this, how dramatic it is, and to many degrees, because you have to pull yourself so much into it, that that's the whole thing about what I was trying to say about the bullfighter trying to feel this whole relationship between the bull and the bullfighter. So like you're like dancing with death, because the same way that sculpture is dancing with the sculpture, because the sculpture is what is going to, charity is what is going to remain there once you're gone, So in a way becomes your child, becomes the thing that you're leaving behind. And I think, the more love you put into that child, the better it will be.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds a bit like you know, but I think there's something very very true to it, you know, through the whole process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's beautiful and wonderful. And I do think there's something quite like even that is having to face the negativity to realize that, like, oh wow, this statue, that the sculpture I just made is probably going to live like much longer than I will ever live. And that's just, you know, you kind of accept your own death in creating, right?
Yes.
And
yes, especially with bronze.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's that's so fascinating to me to think about that, and certainly, you know, reflects very much like with children. It's like, you know, they'll go on to continue living, and you know, there's something that is very, again, I do think there's something quite humbling about it too, because, you know, the art has its own self, you know, it has its own, you know, you see like the bronze sculpture, and you see traces of you like you're shaping on it and everything, but it's traces, right? It's like these glimmers of that, quite literally glimmers, and it's shining in its brilliance. And the thing is that it's not you though, right? Like you won't see Jorge right there, you know.
Yeah.
Like you see
Yeah.
something of you, but not you exactly. And I don't know, I mean, I guess in a way, how do we ever see completely the person? I think it's always partially in glimmers, I would say so, because how do you ever see the full self of another person? But I think that what's, you know, what's fascinating, and again, to go back to the point about it being humbling, is I think about this, like I saw some quote sometime like that they said something about, you know, you died twice, you die when you die, but then the last time your name is ever said or remembered is the other time you die. And I thought that was so, to me, it was like, whoa, so powerful, but also very humbling, because, you know, in a couple generations, you will really not be known at all, you know, or maybe not even remembered. And that's wild, you know, because it's just like, how can that be? And just really coming to terms with that, it can make one feel very like little, insignificant, and like, again, why does it matter? But then you think about what you leave behind, and also what you have experienced yourself in your own lifetime. And it's something where I think the beauty of creating, and why I hope everybody understands their own potential as a creator, not simply as a mother or artist, but just you create your own life, you know, everybody in that way is a type of creator. And so, you know, that you do make a mark on the earth and on those around you, and that will be, in a sense, a type of forever, even though, you know, could you quantify it as forever? Who knows? But it is a type of infinite mark from your finite, your very finite existence. And so, yeah, I think in that way, it's really, you know, I think that's really something powerful about actually doing the art. And I love what you said about this idea of like, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it was breaking up a teeny bit right when you said this, but it was like this idea of, you know, when I was asking, well, why should I even write this poem, you know? And it's this idea that, well, that was that was real right there. Like that was a very real moment. You were there, and that was there, and you weren't anywhere else but with this sort of this thing that's just kind of coming out of you or coming to you, and you just have to sort of like, you know, do something with it. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. And a powerful thing about art is that it kind of in practicing it, it allows us to kind of constantly sort of, or at least try to be in a mode of constantly putting ourselves in a position to be in touch with the real, and those real moments, those real things that are inexplicable and possibly inconsequential, and yet they're extremely consequential because they do something to you, you know, like you said, it's about like sometimes just the perseverance. And I think, again, to bring up the dialectical aspect of Hegel, like there's something about, you know, you said something about you can't force it because it's doing its thing through you, but yet you have to kind of force yourself to show up and to take hold of it. Like there's a strange, you know, relationship with that, where the sailor, you know, I think about a sailboat, and, you know, you're guiding the sail, or like you're using the sail to catch the wind, but you don't control the wind. No, like that, you can't force the wind to go in a certain way, but you have to kind of force yourself to catch that wind and let it take you further. And I think that's what's so fascinating, is like this strange kind of wonderful tension place of the not forcing. You can't force it, but you're forcing yourself. I think that's a really wonderful place.
Please, now that you mentioned about the whole, because this is a point that I think is quite relevant, is the whole thing about the humbleness. We go back to the humbleness and how important. Okay, technique is not. There is something which is technique is not that important anymore. Like we were saying, the classic painters, whatever. Technique is over. Also, let's say the Pollock's, Jackson Pollock, sort of like the whole thing about, the ritual thing, like dripping paint, all of those things. There is no, he in his own words kind of like say, there is no room for accident, and the whole, the things are kind of like pre-programmed somehow, the ritual takes over. I mean, all of those things are interesting. They're interesting points of view, but I think there is, in this kind of like opening to what is really happening, the ability to let go of things, and it's kind of like you can take a heroic stance or an anti-heroic stance in a way, and I think both do take place. Yes. So you have the heroic stance in a way that you have to be there, you have to but then in the same way, sort of like the bullfighters, it kind of like gets caught, like the feet go up on the air, and it's like kind of like stumbling to go back to stand up, and it's really embarrassing in that moment because it's kind of like panicking for his own life. It's not just embarrassing. I think it might be really, really scary. So I think there is that sort of like, okay, position where you're putting everything on the line, in a way, like where that is really, really, really important. The more you do so, it's like you take risks. You don't just do something that is okay. I know this works. You're challenging what it is that you're making, and with the risk of becoming an idiot, and having people laugh at you, and not caring so much, because it's kind of like, so it's that daring thing, and at the same time is very anti-heroic in a way. You have the sort of like dichotomy taking place. And as you were mentioning about the whole thing of the wind and stuff, you remind me to one of my favorite artists that I really like is Jas Van Ader, which is he was working a lot with the idea of the accident himself. So he would just go on a bicycle and have these video pieces where he just like goes through the canals of Brussels, and and this is like goes with the bicycle and kind of like lets himself go into into the canal. He kind of like plays with the idea of the accident in a very nearly comical way. But it's not comical at all. I mean, the guy pushed it to a certain degree where he's like put his life on the line, and he just went into a little boat. I mean, we don't know if this is true. The guy was just fed up with the whole art world, and he said, okay, this is it. I make my own, materialize my own death. He really actually died in this boat because he just went to cross an impossible, I can't remember right now, but he tried to cross the Atlantic, something in a very little boat, and nobody ever saw him again. So it's like kind of like pushing that thing to the absolute limit, which I think is very, I mean, maybe romantic, maybe to all of those things, but there are some artists that they take some very, very radical stances when it comes to this. So I just because you were saying about the wind and all that,
thank you.
It kind of recall, it came back to me, like the image of Jas Van Ader on the little sort of like sailing boat.
No, it almost makes me think about this man. So he lost his life, right? Like I never saw him again, right? After he
Okay. I mean, maybe I mean, there is a lot of it's a bit like Pasolini. I always love when it comes to the whole thing, not just because of his life. He was such such a profound and talented character, and so polemic in so many ways. That he was always kind of like this god. And I mean, his films have so many registers. They're political, they're anti-capitalist, they have, and at the same time, they're extremely human, and they're extremely related to the unconscious, to the whole mythical world. extremely violent, extremely sexual. They're really, really powerful, and at the same time they're very crappy because they're made really like, you know, with very, very kind of like low budget films and people and actors that were not professional actors and things like that. So it's something very, very raw and very real about these films. And it's the same narrative, like with the way he died. Apparently was beaten up by, you know, one of his, you know, pimps, one of his lovers, a younger boy or something. And the way in Heretical Empiricism, which was one of his books, and I think it's in Sequence of a Long Shot or something, he kind of like makes he looks at the editing of the assassination of Kennedy, and he kind of like says how, as an example, the death of Kennedy became, the moment of death becomes the thing that edits your whole life, you know, like, because he was trying to articulate the language of film, and he was sort of like saying, okay, you have a long shot, the short shot, the, you know, the close-ups, all of, and each one of them is kind of like a language in itself. And so how the moment of death kind of like becomes the most relevant thing that is going to edit our peak moments kind of like in our lives. I think maybe in our inner experience, we actually go through that process and the lights go out. You know, maybe something like that also takes place between a lot of these sort of like near-death experiences that people kind of recall. And I think in that respect, you know, sculpture, this is what I was trying to articulate in the other talk, is like a sculpture in a way is kind of like very invasive because it's an object, it's something that it takes, has a physicality to it. Yeah. And that it, you know, kind of like comes and lives with you. It's not like a painting on the wall that, you know, it's kind of like decorative in a way. And also the fact that sculpture, you know, Freud sort of like talking about taboo, talks about the totems, all of those things. Everything is so loaded with the sexual, the whole dimension of death is always there. And for many, many years, especially when it came to casting, I was relating to that sort of like, you know, the William Turner. You have a self-portrait of him and you have his mask as the, you know, of a dead man. So how sculpture is always closer in a way to that sort of like death or final gesture, because it was, you know, is trying to capture a dead face, eyes closed, no lights, lights are off. Whereas, you know, a painting, you have a painting, you're making a portrait of somebody, you put two little white dots in their eyes, that person, that face kind of becomes alive. And I think that's the whole thing about inner shine and all of those things. And about how in a way, there is a lot of artists that they like to play with all of these ideas about, you know, self-reflectivity and all of those things, and becoming more like a guru, like a messenger, like, you know, the artist shaman sort of like thing is always there taking place. And, you know, like I was referring also to Marina Abramovic and her whole sort of like, you know, trying to the artist as a mirror, like the way that she kind of went to the, I think it was in the moment, yes, that she was just like sitting there for I don't know, I think it was like longer than a month, and she will just sit on a chair and people will come to her and she will just try to empty herself to the point that, you know, people will see themselves reflected, and, you know, she will become like a mirror for the other audience. So the whole sort of like dynamics becomes very charged, very emotional, and she's just sitting there for, and then the person comes. And so she's trying to make herself as a mirror to disappear completely so that the people can see themselves reflected. Which I think, you know, perhaps this is something that the gurus sort of like might do. And there is something to do with that acceptance of killing yourself, of, you know, getting rid of your ego to a certain degree, of that first small death before the big death. But you have to accept the big death so you can go through the first one, if that makes sense. And yeah, that's sorry, I don't know when to, because we're talking about the editing of the death.
Yeah, the death. Yeah. No, that's all really, really good, Jorge, and really important. And I was thinking about like his name is Oder, the man who like just what you'd go on as. What's that?
Yeah, I might be saying it wrong.
No, that's okay.
Like,
no.
Yes, Jasmine.
Jasmine, okay. Well, it's fascinating because in a sense, it's funny because I guess I was kind of thinking about, accident and intentionality. Like if you have an intentional accident, is that still an accident? Like the whole nature of an accident is that you didn't anticipate it. You didn't even like, you couldn't even make it happen, right? Like, and you know this well with like broadcasting. I mean, when something drops or, you know, it like you didn't like, you weren't like just swinging it and being like, oh, well, maybe it'll drop, you know, it's like, it just does it. And then you're like, oh, okay, great. Like, we start over, we find, and I love what you said about finding something, you know, you go in the rubble and you say, well, look, like this is still something we can salvage out of this. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately is like when you encounter in the world where there's sometimes lots of hardship or things that are just feel unfair, you know, it's like, why, like, why is it like that? You know, why? And what I think something that I learned from you and from the way that you do art is like to still find something in that you can say, you know, this is beautiful as it is, actually, even in the fact that it was broken, like there's still something we can say that we can take away from this. And it's okay because it's not what you exactly thought it would be like or wanted it to be in terms of your vision. Like I think that's what's so powerful about it is like you have a vision, but then you know it comes and it does what it does, and now it's something different than what you had it envisioned, right? But the vision was actually about something that was the unseen. It was the things that were not necessarily going to be calculated or calculatable, right? And so yeah, I think that's really powerful. But to go back to accidents and intention, you know, it's fascinating because he seemed to be playing with accidents, like making it happen, making accidents happen and allowing himself to, which in some ways is like, it makes me think about children where like they're not trying to like spill the thing or, you know, jump or knock down the thing, but they're kind of trying to at the same time. And but they learn so much, like they're not really, in a way we can say that we re-envision the accident as like, instead of it being an accident, it's actually learning. Like it's actually how you learn is to have the accidents. And he probably learned a lot about himself, about the nature of life. And ultimately what came to mind when you shared about his story was like, in a way he kind of died for what he believed in, right? Like he believed this was worthwhile. And yeah, we could say that's foolish, or, you know, that's the thing. At the end of the day, he may have done something that to most people like, that was really stupid, you know, like that was really foolish of him. He lost his life. Like this is crazy. And yeah, like, of course, life is incredibly valuable, but it's almost like the moments of death like that show that there's something radically, how do I say this? It's almost like it's so valuable that it is fragile, right? It's so valuable that it is so able to be lost. And yes, that can feel like crazy and almost like, well, how can we even live in this world? Like it's all, you know, it's also fleeting. And yet that's the very thing that kind of gives it its very nature, and its very beauty, and its very robustness is in the fact that it's like it's fleeting and fragile, but it's still so beautiful and so worthwhile. And yeah, I think those moments of death, like I think about them too as like, that's such a fascinating concept of it editing your whole life. Like the death is somehow the life, like it suddenly defines the life somehow. And that's so incredibly fascinating, where there's this and, you know, obviously it makes me think of like you know, even to think about a death that's life, like if we think about Jesus and his death, resurrection, it resurrects the entire, what is known to be as the life itself. And there's something really wild about that, and something that perhaps is like, even though it's hard to sit with death, just because life never feels like it'll end, you know, like in a strange way, like, you know, when you know someone, right, and then you've known them for years and decades, and then suddenly they're not there anymore. It's so surreal. Like it's so surreal. It might be the most surrealist art ever, right? They're there and they're not there, and yet they are there because you have them inside of your heart and your mind, and you remember them and you recall them in these little moments. And so it seems difficult to like even understand how to live with death, because death is not a thing in life, but yet it is to the ones who remain. And it's funny to me, like the remains, like I think there's so much wordplay there, like, you know, the remains of the dead, but it's like we are the remains of the dead. It's a very interesting thing to think about, but in a way there's something that's defining about it. And that's kind of the redemptive element of death, even though it's not something you like seek out, but you, and that's the other thing I was thinking. To me, something that I perhaps a good framing for accidents is to not like not that I'm trying to like, again, the man who Otter, like that's really fascinating. And again, maybe we can see him, if we want to take the heroic versus the foolish stance, he like died for something he believed in, which is actually pretty incredible.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, like, I think what the form of art, especially that you do, and what I really took from the Skin of the Bull and your thinking behind that, is like to embrace the act. You don't like try, you're not like going in there with the, you know, with the pickaxe on your staff, like intentionally, but like if it happens, then you work with it, you know. You say, okay, I wasn't intending that, because the whole idea of it being a true accident is that you had some sort of other intention for this. But then you work with it, you work with the accident, you work with the spill or the whatever. And so therefore, in a way, you sublate the accident into learning itself, like actually learning and becoming more resilient in yourself, because it's, again, you're the one being made through the process at the end of the day. And so it's and that's kind of a type of work that doesn't ever, you know, it can never be like deteriorated in terms of it being like your own. A growth is something, yeah, I guess you can have like regression in a sense, but there's, in a way, like, even that, again, if we think about a new attitude toward it, even any types of further accidents are always an opportunity to learn again, or learn something new about oneself, or learn something new about life. And to be in a sense, you know, try to be fearless if you can, try to be like bold if you can, because that's the other thing, where like you're talking about bronze sculpture taking up space, and like that's the other thing I think about a lot with art, because I'm like, oh, like it would be kind of cool to, you know, do some more like whatever it is, you know, charcoal, whatever. But then I'm like, where would I put this? And like, who wants this? Nobody would necessarily. I don't know. I'm just, you know, these are all the thoughts that come to minds, I think, for me, when I just think to myself, like, well, where would I put this, and what would I do with it, and why? But I think there's something that kind of like the beauty of that contention is that it insists upon taking up space. Like, it's okay. It's okay that it exists and that it's taking up space. That's okay. You're taking up space, and that's good, because you matter, right? Like, you know, it's, and I think that's why it kind of comes down to like this strange affirmation of self in working with the negativity of creating, because you have to say, yeah, actually, like this little poem I scribbled down on a post-it note, and probably like, you know, stash away with all my other post-it notes, like maybe it doesn't matter, but it does not, like I have to believe somehow that I matter enough to do something that doesn't matter, because it matters to me. Somehow it matters to me, and then somehow that could maybe inspire other people to see their own value, right? Their own value that they have in just taking up space or existing, right? Or being in the world, and like, don't apologize for your physical form and the fact that you'll bump into somebody in the grocery store. It's okay. You don't have to apologize. You know, you're here, and that's a good thing. So yeah, those are just a myriad of different thoughts that were coming to mind with what you're sharing. But yeah.
I think, you know, like there is that difficult balance, you know, in between, you know, like, well, it's good to take space, it's good to, you know, to be here, I think that's why the whole thing about absolute necessity, you know, that you have to be there. There is no other way, you know, like this is something that needs to be done. You just, you know, you're just there for it to be materialized somehow. And that necessity, once you kind of like become a little bit aware of it, then there is no, it kind of, it takes over, you know. You just have to do it, because there is no other way. You know, but at the same time, it's the difficult balance between not thinking once it's done that you're actually doing something, if that makes sense, you know. It kind of like happens. You're witnessing how it unveils itself, and at the same time you are there, articulating it, learning from it, and trying to empty yourself in this making, if that makes sense. So the more you empty yourself while you're making the sense of self as something which is on the other side, which is bigger than you, it kind of like takes over more and more.
Well, that's the kind of, that's again like this sort of strange doubleness, or the A-B nature of it, where it's like, you know, you matter, I matter, we have matter and we matter, but there's also the sense in which to go back to this idea of like, there is something bigger moving, that there is something bigger that will last longer than our own finite existence that's at play through us. And so it's sort of like being able to take yourself seriously enough to do your own art, but also not take it too seriously, because
Yeah,
you know, that tension place of serious and not serious.
Exactly. Especially in contemporary art, you always have to kind of like keep it a little bit playful and light and fun, and articulate it in a way which you can engage, you know, a little bit of I mean, the culture that we're living on now, you know, which is superficial, but at the same time, not necessarily. It can be very profound. So you have to be, you know, kind of like mediating both worlds without being too heavy or without being too light in a way. Especially when it comes to commercial work, that's for sure one of the
I wanted to ask you something about commercial work, if that's okay, because I think it's really fascinating to think about. And I had a talk with my friend Bethany Tabor about art, like in the more commercialized way, because she works with art curation and things like that. And I think there's something very, I wonder because I've never really spoken to an artist who has insight into the commercial world of art. Is it something that really challenges your, like, what basically, like, my question is basically, what are the pros and cons of it? Like, are there things that are, you know, you would say like, these are great, these actually help me in my transformative process, these things over here I could do without, but I have to kind of deal with them, and maybe in that way it still kind of offers its own sublational process, because it's like, oh, this stuff over here is sort of a headache, but maybe it makes you more strong. But then there's also some of it that probably feels like, you know, like if you're an academic and you're like, oh, all the bureaucratic stuff, I don't really want to have to deal with that. And it can be stifling, potentially stifling to creativity. But do you ever find it to be stifling to your creativity? And what are generally the pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you have to come up with a good strategy that allows you to have the most sort of like freedom, so you can still remain very creative within what it is that you're making, and at the same time not to lose your own sort of like identity or you know, like your signature, let's put it like that. So so you have enough presence and is appealing enough for people to resonate with it to the degree that they want to, you know, oh wow, I want to have this, you know. So is but at the same time you cannot really think about, I'm doing this because, you know, so there is that other dimension of it that, you know, it has to have a certain degree of profundity, at least for me personally. Where if that is not there, or the message or even the concept behind is not strong enough, it doesn't have enough gravity, even though we were talking about the concept is you need to have a certain gravity to what it is that you're making, which I think is very important, and you have to remain faithful to that more than anything else. Yes, more than anything else.
I like that.
Yes, and I think, you know, like curators and people that understands, and you will come with the people that, you know, like likes you and understands what it is that you're trying to make, and they will open doors if you, I think, you know, if you go for it full on. But of course, you know, it's not. It's always a negotiation. At the same time, everything is always a negotiation, you know, as well. So you have to try and make the most out of both worlds if you can. And I was also thinking, you know, about the whole thing. You know, we were talking about just another and editing of death and all of this. We were talking about that, and also it came to me also Simone Weil, you know, came to me because to a certain degree she also kind of like fast herself to death, you know, in a way, just because she wanted to, you know, I don't know, like have that static experience, get closer to God, whatever. So she ended up just like killing herself to edit also her own life in a different way. So I find that also quite fascinating. And I don't know, I think the way I see this perhaps is relating it a bit to the sort of like contemporary commercial art in a way or another, is like there has to be a point where you have little depths into what it is you're making. Yes, you have to have these petit morts, like it has to be ecstatic enough, and you have to put enough joy sense enough into what it is that you involve yourself enough for it to have that little depth, and you let go of it, and then you open yourself up to another, and to another, and to another. And I think that if you manage to make that, commercial thing, fantastic. If you don't, as soon as you remain truthful to what it is that you're trying to do, I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful.
Yes.
No, that's wonderful. Really quick, I think that I've always been fascinated by that French term, like the petit mort, because like the idea of death that comes in ecstasy, and there's this I'm kind of thinking now like about you mentioned the long shot. This is the artist. Was that something? Was that a film he made, or was that an art he made? The long shot.
Yeah, Pasolini is a very fascinating figure. Not only because his whole life was, he said it himself. I think there's a quote where he kind of like says, I'm rephrasing, is something like, I'm always impressed how contradictory I must be in order to be truly consistent.
Yeah.
Yes, something along the lines. And basically that's how he lived his life, full on. And his films go from, Saló, Sodoma and Gomorrah, from, like the whole Marquis de Sade, making a parallel with the whole fascist world in Italy, and like torture, and it's really, really a power, like really, and that was towards the end of his life. And at the beginning of his career, well, middle, he made the Passion according to Saint Matthew, which is, even the Pope kind of like, like they made it one of the most kind of like spiritual, having a book of the church and all of these things. So the guy had this sort of like, contradiction going on through his life. He was a crazy super communist, very gay, very like, this is making constantly statements against bourgeois society. But then he also was very kind of fashion sort of like person. He would like to have a lot of expensive cars. It was all of these contradictions going on constantly throughout his life. And then he was a poet, and he also made drawings, and so he made all of these beautiful films, crappy sometimes good. And then he wrote Hermetical Empiricism, if I'm saying it correctly. I mean, it's a long time I haven't revisited that book, but it's basically trying to articulate the whole language of filmmaking from a very linguistics, and also from sort of like trying to make sense of what it is to film in order to articulate a language. If that makes sense. And is a lot of his writing is really, 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 really good. Really good. He's got some interviews with Oscar, I believe it's Oswald. That's his surname. I can't remember his name now. And there's a book with a whole interview with him, which is really, really beautiful. And he talks also about a lot of these things about editing.
Yeah, I just think that terminology of the you were saying, which I thought was so beautiful and true, like in film, that there's the different languages of like the short shot, the long shot,
Yes.
But even this idea of like just playing on that language of, well, it's kind of a long shot. That's what often sometimes I think art is like, it can feel like a long shot, like I'm making this and I hope this expresses what I'm trying to express, or I don't know, you're doing things that are very much a long shot. And even like, I think people may say like, I think about people wanting to maybe aspiring to be like a professional artist. It can feel like being a long shot, because there's a lot of people who probably want to do that, a lot of competition. How do I do that? And but I think that's kind of in life, it seems like sometimes doing the things that are kind of a long shot are one of the best kind of you know, again, you could call it crazy, but some of the most like inspiring people are people who take the long shot, you know, who go for that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, yeah, and exactly. And yeah, I was thinking too about this idea of so you know, we were talking, just thinking about long shot just in terms of that terminology and the long process. Do you think that it will get kind of more difficult, or maybe the difficulty will show up somewhere else for artists today, where there can be a lot more ease of getting resources, or, you know, like we were saying, the internet, there's a lot more that people can just kind of like very quickly at the tip of their finger sort of get. Do you think that will make it like more challenging actually to, or more tempting to like subvert that process? I mean, I know I brought this up a little bit already, but I'm just kind of curious, like what your thoughts are
Yes.
on that, and if maybe like if the difficulty crops up in a new way, where could that be? Like, could it just merely be distraction, or not, like, or maybe a concept that wasn't actually mediated in thinking? Because I think that's a lot of times what I like, and I didn't have a lot as much exposure as you have, Jorge, to the art world, but I was a secretary at an art building for a couple of years, and so yeah, so I just sort of like, I'd listen, and like, you know, I would help set up galleries, and then I would listen to the artists talking, and I'd like sit in on meetings sometimes. Like, and something that was always interesting to me was I always appreciated like the kind of out there conceptual art. It was always really interesting to me, but I did sometimes feel like, because I had the privilege to talk to the artists themselves, maybe it's just because I asked too many questions, or like I'm like a bit nosy on stuff, but I really always appreciated it when the artist themselves was like thoughtful about their own work, like not beyond just like, yes, the concept can be great and that's really neat as it is, but actually the mediation of the concept, like that's what always would be very impactful for me, was where like, okay, so that's great, but like, how does this actually maybe transform you into seeing the world around you, or, you know, other people? Like, the idea itself is great, but it's merely, you know, Daniel has this paper called Ideas Are Not Experiences. So you can have the idea, but how does it relate to experience? So, but yeah, I don't know, I'm wondering, because, you know, it's easier to, I don't know, in a way, maybe the fact that it's easy to make art, or like digital formats and stuff like that, like there's something that could, maybe the difficulty will come somewhere else, maybe not in sweat and, you know, and like muscles, like where you're actually having to do the stuff, but maybe somewhere else, maybe it's more existential difficulty. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think, yeah. I mean, like always, new media kind of like brings challenges,
Yeah.
you know, with itself. I mean, there is a lot of artists that they like to use iPads. I mean, even Peter Doig. Like, I mean, there is so many different that they just like to use, you know, like digital media to make drawings over pictures and all of these things. And some of them are very good. And I think for me, as soon as you're able to bring something which is kind of like very, it brings up very personal perspective, or something which is, because at the end of the day, you know, the wheel has already been invented or invented so many times. I think the new media can open up a lot of possibilities for art, and they're just tools at the end of the day. And it's the way how you use it, or people use it, which can make them either very lame, obviously, because the whole accessibility and the whole sort of like ease that comes with it can make it very banal. Oh, nobody can do this. So, you know, even when we go to the whole thing about documentation, you know, like you go through Instagram, everybody's documenting their works, and everything is so much in the surface most of the times, and it's like, you know, about, oh, this, and it's very gimmicky, and there is no, you know, I think there is a need for substance, regardless of the media they use, how new it is, or how. But for me, as you know, I kind of like always try to say the skin and the sense of touch of making things with the hands, making things physically. It becomes very important to me, because of the whole involvement with the body. The whole thing becomes very performative as well, in a way. and the way you paint with the hands is very different to the result that you get with a brush, for example, and way more different as well to the result that you get in an iPad. So I think media and digital media and all that is removing us more and more from our lived experience, which is it can be problematic. At the same time, it can be good, because it can open new doors and things like that. But let's say maybe I'm a bit too old-fashioned when it comes to that. For me, I like the physicality of things. I mean, the whole thing about NFTs and stuff. I get all the time people, you want an NFT, and it's something that I may have to do. Eventually, sure. I don't even understand the concept of it to a degree where I say, okay, well, yeah, let's do this. Because, it's such a new, I mean, it's not new anymore. It's been here for a long time already. But there is something about the physicality of it. And it can be very good for artists, the fact that you're making profit in every single sale, and it's very fair. It's actually much more fair than the whole sort of like, we just make money once and that's it, and then the rest is for the collectors. If that makes sense. So there are possibilities, and they're creating new possibilities in the market, and things can be very good if you are able to navigate those seas, those muddy waters. But for me, I don't know. It's a personal choice. The whole thing about touching, painting with hands, painting with your body, doing things that are very much related to the print, to the imprint, to the breath, to the sweat, to all of those things, to which I think has something very therapeutic about it. So much more than things that they are very, and I think, it's like everything is YouTube. You can go to YouTube. We are now on YouTube, but you can go to YouTube. You can learn about so many things. But you have to go through. I mean, I say this. I used to play a lot of tennis. I love tennis, and nowadays you have so much information, about things like this, and you look at all of these videos and say, "Oh, I know how to." No, you don't know. You know the theory of how to do it. You still have to go through the hardest, thing of making thousand repetitions of that shot until you actually start to get it. Yes, so this is a little bit of the same, and I would love to have a look at Daniel's paper on that, because I mean this whole project was about going from the experience of making it and trying to unveil through writing and share what it is, what happens when you make something, which is something very intimate, and it's in the articulation where things can be shared in a very unique way. Because you make the articulation even more intimate when you're trying to explain something to somebody else. Because you are learning it further. Yes, you are really relearning it as you are trying to make it either more artistic or more poetic or more informative. But I think it's in that order. Yes, artistic, poetic, or maybe poetic, artistic, informative. Yes, and I think that's all. Perhaps also one of the problems with philosophy, the way we understand it, which is nowadays, which I mean, those are very big words, but like theory, when you're trying to fit theory into practice, into life, that's always a little bit problematic. It's always better to bring out your theories out of your lived experience. I believe so. I mean, I might be completely wrong with, I'm not a philosopher, nor I try to, put myself into that position. But philosophy has to have that depth of field of lived experience. I think that's why Hegelian, because he kind of puts the subject at the very center of the experience. Without that, there's just categorical classes of things, concepts over concepts over concepts, and I think that's extremely relevant. And perhaps new media brings that problem. That's what brings that problem, and that problem will always be there, I think. But it makes things very easy. That's for sure.
So you're saying that the digital makes things very easy, the web, like all of that makes things very easy. So and I think that what I'm fascinated about, that was all really, really beautiful and wonderful, and I think a lot about something that stood out to me, what you said about the therapeutic, is so important because there's something about like somebody might be seeking out YouTube videos, and obviously this is going to go up on YouTube. Like there's no
Yeah,
problem.
yeah, yeah.
I understand there's a
Of
place for this medium, but
of
I
course, of
do
course.
sometimes feel like somebody can kind of be trying to get in touch with something through YouTube, which is really funny because it's like the whole idea of the word is it's a YouTube, like it's almost like you're trying to get in touch with you, like with yourself somehow by like kind of eagerly taking in whatever it is, whether it's like technique tennis videos or it's videos on like some philosophy or there's some this, and like there's a value to that, but we have to be honest with ourselves that we are quite literally not in touch at all with ourselves when we when we lose touch with things, when we lose touch with like our physical phenomenological experiences. The best of both worlds is when they can feed into each other, and that's where you can listen to something that then, and I'm sure too, like you'll listen to certain lectures while you're doing art or when you're in the studio, like there's a beautiful way that there's a dialectic between what I'm making and what I'm listening. So the concept, the logic informs the actual, like whether it's the pathological practice, the practice and the theory work together simultaneously, but they should always be doing this in an infinity loop. And it's not actually, it just becomes, to me, that's like the ultimate like resolving of like the negative. Well, we're going to face negativity, but what I mean to say is like self-relating negativity.
Yes.
It has to be resolved with infinity, because what happens is then it's still the continual motion, but it goes outside of yourself and inside of yourself and outside of yourself. Whereas if it's just you in, just kind of like downward spiral of just relating to yourself negatively, which actually never allows you to actually face negativity, because you just kind of insulate yourself, and so yeah, so to me, like the infinity is really important. But what that requires is kind of, going outside of ourselves and then into ourselves in this oscillation. Now, we can go outside of ourselves really well through books, lectures, and all of these things. Just the reality of the matter is that when we use digital surfaces, they are surfaces. They are the superficial element, which is necessary. But we have to learn to kind of like incorporate them into our lives through certain practices. I think things like, obviously, like the artistic process, people can do this pretty much with anything they're already doing. It's just that they think get more thoughtful about, oh, how does that actually relate to what I'm doing over here? And how can that maybe change my perspective or change what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, so that I'm actually tying in the theory to my practice. And there's something about like the actual doing it, whether it's, you having your own business, whether it's being a student, whether it's being a mother, whether it's being an artist, whether it's being, a child, where there's just something about the actual physical play, getting dirty, whatever it is. I think maybe what can be tempting about the digital surfaces is very clean. It's very clean. There's no like, you actually can't mess on it. If you really like, you dumped your tea on it, then you maybe broke your iPad or whatever. Like exactly. Yeah. And so yeah, there's strangely, like, I'm really interested in thinking like a lot harder about like the medium itself, because there's a lot of potential. It's kind of spurious infinity if we think Hegelian terms, right? Like there can potentially be a spurious infinity because the internet's never ending, right? You can watch a million videos up right in a row, but when you have a true infinity, what it should be doing is moving back to you and back out. So whatever you're learning, you're incorporating into what you're actually doing. So you watch the tennis videos, then you go actually play tennis and actually do the thing and see if you can actually pick it up yourself. And that's the benefit of it. But it's just that it's so easy to think like, oh, I'm doing it, or but you haven't done it because you've only ever thought it. And that's actual, like, when I was saying about this moment of like, oh, why should I even write this poem? Why is it about it? Well, because then you're actually doing it. Just for the sake of the fact that you're actually doing it, there's value. There's something so valuable about this, because it's easy to just think about making or think about whatever. And then when you're actually doing it, you're like, oh, wow, yeah, like skin is in the game, the skin of the bull, like skin is in the game. I'm in this. And it's actually like my own time. And I always think about Kojal's quote where he says like time is man, is literally yourself. You're pouring yourself into, and you're imprinting yourself in that time with what you're making and what you're actually doing. And yeah, it's a risk, but that risk is what makes you more alive, more human. So but I'm interested in to think harder about like digital surfaces, because they really don't allow, like, okay, another example really quick, and then I'll pass it back to you. But like, for example, it can also be this day and age, if you think about children, they may, and it depends on the household or what people's views are of this and the other, with screen time or watching screens or watching things. But I mean, I think my perspective is like, keeping moderation. There's a set time, but the other time we're going to go outside, we're going to do this, that, the other. So I mean, you could just not have it at all. And again, people have different opinions about that, but it's like, I also think you can sort of see it as a way to have it as a tool, utilize it, show how you can learn how to tune a ukulele on YouTube. There's like cool things you can do with it. But I think that I could see potentially how, oh, well, if the kids are just, watching a show or watching something on an iPad, they're not pulling out all the toys. They're not pulling out all the stuff, and it's less mess. And so I think that's very tempting for people, because mess can be wonderful, but it's also chaotic and can be overstimulating, because you're like, I cannot even think right now because there's stuff all over the table, all over the floor. And you know what I mean? You're just trying to like move through the space, and there's something about chaos being necessary, but also in the nature of chaos, it can be chaotic. And so you have this balance of, I mean, what's beautiful about, for me, with mothering is like the constant ebb and flow. Things get pulled out, it's messy, then we put it away. And it's like this constant, pull it out, pull it away, pull it out, pull it away. And it's, we make a mess, we eat, I put the time into making the meal, then it's all gone. And then we do it again. And this is like constant repetition. But it's always stuff that like is never really done. You can never really be done with it. You're not. It's always ongoing, and so in that way, like it's fascinating to me. But yeah, I think I mean, for me, my own personal perspective is like just being very careful with moderation, utilizing it, but in a certain time where we've had other things we've done for the day, where we're whatever, playing outside, playing with Legos, doing stuff with our hands. Because the thing is, children for so many years, like it was just go outside in the woods, or like, you didn't even have a whole lot of toys. You'd be making toy out of, like, my mom would talk about like an oxtail that would be her like doll, like you would just make things out of the stuff you had in your, like you didn't have like maybe a ton of resources, but you were playing, and you were, so just like the imagination and the physicality. I do wonder if the temptation with digital surfaces in general, and I just wanted to get a very practical example because I think it's important and relevant, but it's easier. Sometimes I think there is that ease, but the thing is, with that ease can come, how do I put this? The fact of the matter is, it gets harder sometimes than to know what to do with your boredom, right? Like when you just have your, I mean, I'm really thankful because in my life, my mom really cultivated like a different attitude toward boredom for me. So I don't tend to find myself being bored, because I'm always like, oh my gosh, there's so much I want to do. If ever was bored, I'd be like, that means I have some sort of spare time. I could do whatever this thing I've been wanting to do. I can pick like one of the 15 things that I've been wanting to do, just, you know what I'm saying? But I think that is interesting, because boredom can also come even in activity. And what that means is that, there's kind of a sense of, maybe it's less easy to identify as boredom, but it could be like this feeling of, I don't know how to put this, sort of a lackluster, sort of, you're doing the stuff, but you're kind of like, anyways, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of like what exactly is boredom, because there could be different nuances to it. But the main point is that it gets, every time there's new ease, there's always going to be an opportunity, there's always going to be some other hardship cropping up somewhere else, and I think the hardship that can arise is actually literally how to handle mass and how to handle free time, like the fact that you have time and what are you going to do with it. And can you, I don't want to say entertain yourself, but can you make something out of that instead of it just be presented to you, right? Like everything's all done and it's just presented to you and you just get to kind of like consume it. But how are you making, what are you making? How are you seeing that what you're doing is a part of your own learning process and making who you are? And I mean, obviously people can talk about, like, as people get into adulthood, and there can be sort of the sense of not knowing how to like be better about their time and using their time to scrolling on Facebook or whatever it is, whatever social media app it is. And I actually did a recording about that on Anchor, or our Spotify Anchor podcast, where I talked about scrolling, and I get into some stuff there. But the main point of the matter is there's always going to be, like, where there's ease, there's going to be a new type of hardship. And I think in some ways my thought of this is like, if you actually kind of just are willing to do the hard first, you get both. It's always still going to be hard and easy, but like you get the ease of being able to sit still in a room and not feel like, well, and just be like sad because you're bored. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I'm not, because I'm going to go do. And yeah, it's very human to feel that feeling. So I think for me, I try not to like vilify that, but it's just that I try to talk about it as it's an opportunity. If you're feeling bored, it's an opportunity for you to do something you haven't done in a while, or there's something you can go see you haven't seen in a while, go explore you haven't explored in a while.
Go and explore it.
Yeah. But I just think, I'm fascinated with this relationship between like mass and digital surfaces, because they are so sleek and not messy. and I love, like, with your art where you're painting, like, it sounds like, a lot of your painting you're doing with your hands, right? Is this right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I do use hands, and I always like to be in that space between, let's say, sculpture and painting. I mean, I think this whole dialectical thing, I think you have to create a certain tension with what it between constantly. So you have to always kind of take two ends and stretch them and see where that stretch kind of like takes you. Yes, if that makes sense, until the point that it nearly breaks. So in that respect, like, dichotomies, I'm always playing with these sort of like extremes, and sculpture. I like to make a sculpture. Like, recently I've been doing a lot of glass sculpture, because there is something about glass that is very beautiful. You can see through it. It's still a sculpture, but you actually, even though it's a sculpture, most of the sculptures that you see, you really want to touch them. The sculpture has that bronze, whatever the material, marble, is tactile. People want to touch it. But glass, because it's such a fragile material, people is like, you kind of like, you have the feeling of, you have the opposite feeling. You want to look at it because you can see the transparencies, you can understand the shape through it. So it's a much more visual experience, but it's a sculpture. And in painting, I like to work with the other extreme of what it is that you're pulling away from, and I like to use a lot of elements from the actual bronze casting, or from mold making, from sculpture, silicones, rubbers. I like to use all of those things within the actual bidimensional plane to make it a little bit more three-dimensional, and to play a lot with textures, and to make them quite tactile, so the people that looks at it wants to interact with it in a more sort of like, tactile manner. And I like to play with those sort of like dichotomies. And I think it's important to try and bring the senses, the whole sort of like phenomenological sort of like thing. You have to have the whole, kind of like picture of it. It's a way to bring an audience to I don't know, to relate to it in a different way. That I think this format is very easy to just, as you said, scroll through. To just like, we're just so used to it as well, that it's very easy to get tired. However, you see a glass piece, you see a painting, which you play around with, the whole sensory experience, the best way I can. And I think that's always challenging for an audience, and it's always people react to it in a way or another. So it's a call for the body. It's a call for the physical experience. It's a call for to make sure we don't forget about it. If that makes sense in the way we're moving. But yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of very good things coming up from it as well, which I'm not necessarily against it. But I don't know. I think the tactile and exploring the visual in a tactile manner is important. Otherwise, things become too flat. You have a lot of flat painters all over. If that makes sense, yes.
Oh yeah, so, no, that makes perfect sense, and I appreciate you sharing on that and sharing your own kind of preference with the tactile and the physical. And yeah, there's something quite cathartic about, I mean, I just think about it as a dancer. Like I always really appreciate and enjoy just like, you know, for me to extend and move the body is the way to extend in like internally. And mentally, it's like even though, you know, it's like, well, you're just doing that with your body, but yes, but at the same time, it somehow doing the physical act makes it more real to think about movement of the mind and the thought, and the stretching of the mind and the thought. And if there's something just extremely cathartic and really good and wonderful about actually moving, like physically moving around in space and through space. And for me, that's like what I always find as like a cathartic therapeutic practice is with dance. And I think about like just the idea of how, you know, with children, to relate it back, you know, I know I do that a lot, but it's just, you know, being a mother, a lot of my time is with children. So it's hard for me not to think about the relations that are so evident. But like children, they're very tactile, you know, they love to like just stick their hand in the bucket of rice, or, you know, there's even books that are made like, oh, feel the dog or feel this, but literally they'll just do it with anything, put things in their mouth to feel it. And, you know, I think there's something about this, the feeling and the textures, like it makes me wonder, you know, and again, I'm not trying to make some sort of like, you know, some sort of like moral judgment on it. I'm not, because there are really good things that come out of, like you're saying, the digital spaces. I mean, like, for example, even having a conversation like this here together, but it's just that I do wonder if we, you know, I was thinking about some word connections where it's like tactile, tactful. You know, sometimes we're like, for example, on the internet spaces, sometimes people aren't very tactful sometimes, because they're forgetting they're like actually talking to a real human being, and it's like that's a real person. You know, it's not just some you know user 2753. You know, like they're an actual human being.
Yes,
you know, and so I think I wonder if there's something about actually the tactile experiences that make us maybe perhaps more tactful with one another in our engagement. And also the idea of feeling things, it's almost interesting, because in a way I wonder if to actually feel physical objects and paint and, you know, the fabric and the, you know, all of it, the metal, the wax, the heat, all of this thing that goes into making these materials do what they do, and then, you know, creating something with them, this, that feeling is like a way to make something with our feelings, you know, like to actually do something with feeling itself. Whereas if it's not, it's pent up in just this kind of, you know, reactive, all the reaction happen here instead of out here. What do you think?
I think there is a sort of like insight that you gain from doing something with your hands, and there is a way of understanding which only comes from that actual experience of playing with those materials, of looking at negative molds, doing all of those things, all of these kind of like everything becomes very, you know, negative spaces. All this becomes so literal in what it is that you're making, that you're actually seeing it and you're thinking through in these terms. You know, you have the empty molds, you have something which, a body which was there and now it's not there anymore. You know, you have voice, you have abysses, you have all of those, you know, reflective sort of like surfaces, and you want to make them more reflective, and all of those things. There is that interaction with those materials, with them, that that brings something to the actual quality of what it is that, you know, how you actually look at the world afterwards. As I think, you know, the same way you're a dancer, you move your body in a particular way, it gives you a certain, I mean, I that's how I understand it. I wish I could be a dancer myself, because I just find it really beautiful, the way to, you know, express through your body in that way. I think there's something very liberating, and then you understand your body in a way that you will see somebody else moving, and then you understand their way of moving. You might know more about their persona just by the way they move their body, because you know your body so well. If you know your body so well, you know what it takes to move a certain way, that then when you see somebody moving, you understand I don't know, their sort of like mental space, how they like body language, whatever, you can read it because your knowledge of your body is you're much more tuned with it. And I think something like this really does take place as well. When you involve yourself into long hours of maybe less grinding or making molds or whatever, you start seeing the world in a different way, which I think the screens and the the sort of like hours that we spend. I mean, I don't want to be moralizing either, but there is something which is much more. It does not allow us to experience things to that degree, So your empirical sort of, I don't know. It's just not there. It's not there. Everything is much more visual, and like I was relating to Jasper Meyer, like this was like a animator sculpture from the 70s, Polish, which will make like these beautiful heads, one of clay, and one was constructing another, and they're really beautiful images, and it's all like animation. So there are sculptures which are being animated one by one by one by one. So and he will say that he will trust much more the sense of touch than the sight, because it's a much more tired and perverted sort of like the eyesight, the looking, the gaze is much more manipulated, perverted, and this was already in the 70s. So imagine nowadays how the guy might be, if he looks at it now. You see what I mean? So it's a bit like, and I think that's true. I think there's something much more truthful about lived experience when the fact that we can touch things kind of like brings us, because when you touch something, there is a connection between your inner world and the outer world through the skin. Yes, through the skin. So is that you're not just looking at it from a distance. There is that presence of you really contacting it, and I think that's in the virtual world is not there yet. Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe that's very particular to sculpture in a way, and I think to understand there is a knowledge that comes from it which is particular to sculpture. That's it. It's the same as particular to dancers to understand the world in that way, or poets, or philosophers. Yeah.
I was just thinking that was all so beautiful and so good, Jorge. And I was thinking about the idea. Well, and it's more like a question, because I know it's true with glass, but I don't know with bronze casting. But what's so fascinating too is that actually there's a period where like you can't touch it because it's very hot. Like it's very, very hot. It's very warm, right? So it's like, just when you're like, okay, like it's interesting, because I think about the birth process, and the baby comes out and you're like, thank God, and you can hold the baby fine, you can hold the baby will start nursing immediately in the first few minutes. And it's interesting though, because there's a kind of there has to be this process where like it's so hot you can't touch what you just made. You have to like let it cool down. You have to just literally be with it and witness it. And that's a very fragile time, right? Because something, when it's hot, so hot, it can, obviously somebody can get burned, but also the piece itself is very mobile, fluid still, and it's solidifying into what it will be. And then when it cools down, you can touch it, whatever you need to do, filing or whatever it is you need to do, depending on the medium, and then you can kind of hold it. But ultimately you only hold it for a certain time. Like, and my mom has this little like embroidered pillow where it says something like, we hold their hands for a certain time, but we hold their hearts forever, or something, just some sort of maternal quote about how, and fortunately Lord willing, you can always be in your lives with each other, even as adults, but you don't necessarily hold them over your shoulder when they're 57, right? Like they're a big man now, you might hold their hand, but you're not holding them the same way you did. You're certainly not holding them in your womb the way you did. They're birthed into the world, they're released into the world, and there's something about this sort of like having to come to terms with, you hold it for a while, but you at some point it's out of your hands, really. It is. And that's the beautiful tension place of the creator mother, where you create, but then you also let it go and you witness what it does in the world for the world. And that's beyond you, but you had a part in that. And that's something that's quite beautiful. And yeah, I think those very lived experiences, lived physicality of it. I'm wondering if there's like a way in which we still need that as humans. And so I wonder what's happening with that need or that drive, like if that kind of can actually increase people's propensity for maybe addictive behaviors, because even though addiction isn't necessarily a physical substance, there's something about it that gives us a sense of being in touch with something that we are wanting to reach and feel touched by or feel whatever. So I'm wondering, I mean, I'm just completely theorizing on the spot here, but I'm just wondering, what is it that we start to do when we're using something for, for time during the day, and then we don't have the physical component that should kind of come from it? Like, do we seek that out elsewhere? I mean, I guess you could, in a healthy ways, figure out just in making sure to incorporate the actual lived experiences, the actual physical stuff, the getting sweaty, whether it's playing tennis, making art, for me, like, playing outside with the children, going to the forest or whatever it is.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's just, I wonder if it's, it's funny because in some time in the years to come, I wonder if, like, bronze casting and such form of art will be particularly novel, like it will be particularly novel to actually make stuff that's physical, that's there, because it could be the case that there's so much more data, and the bulk of what's being made is more digital. So then it'll become like even more rare to have like physical pieces of
to
art.
have a physical object. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing with the whole digital thing, like nowadays you can put in computers, they can make a painting perfectly, they can make a sculpture perfectly just by giving a description of it. And they make amazing artwork, the computers themselves already. And also, 3D scans, 3D printers that you can make bronze objects directly from the machine. Not necessarily, it's kind of like organs without bodies type of thing. Like the whole thing is completely more and more delusional in many ways. But I think there is something that goes with the whole digital thing, that it becomes less and less human, less and less, the whole human thing kind of like gets lost. But I think that's the whole thing about filling up the void, no? I mean, like most of the people that they really get into addictions and all of these things, most of the times they've been lack of affection from the father, from the mother. Like the void is very big because of, dramatic lack of something through other that are bringing, and then it's kind of like that necessity to fill the void. So I think, I mean, I'm not trying to be moralizing with that as well, but that the screen time, let's just put it like that, for kids should be never taking over the playful time, the time with the interactivity, physical interactivity. But in that respect, what you just said about motherhood and touching and holding, and you can do that for many years, but not for so long. All of these things really, really beautiful, and I think that's at the core of things as well. These kind of like that's the core of human experience, I believe, in many ways. So the more we can maybe translate that tenderness into things that we are making, or I don't know, there is something about it that is really, really important. I think as a creative person, as a philosopher, as a dancer, whatever, you want to try and bring those sort of like qualities that they can bring some, I wouldn't say healing, because I don't think it's the right word, but there is something that comes from you that is willing to touch something bigger than you, and that needs to be kind of like transpire through you, and it has to be making an impact to a certain degree, and I think that's important, and the art has the ability to do so, and I think maybe through the machine can also be done. I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that we will know maybe sooner rather than later. I mean, you know, maybe it's much more around the corner than we might think it is. But I think it's very important not to lose that part of it.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I totally agree. And I just really quick, I know I could talk with you for many more hours. I know it's getting late your side, so I don't want to keep you from actually going to bed. But I just want to touch really quick on that was all beautiful and wonderful. And I was thinking about bullfighting, you know, you brought that up, and being from Spain, and I lived in Spain for a short time, but you know what, it's such a beautiful country, and I love the culture. I love learning about bullfighting. I actually had a teacher in my American school who, when I was learning Spanish just as a class, that was really fascinated by bullfighting. And so she would she took it upon herself. I love it. Like, she did stuff kind of out of the curriculum. Like, she taught us a lot about El Greco and like art as Spanish artist. And I love that. Yeah. And then we also learned a lot about bullfighting. And what I think is fascinating is that, you know, you could maybe theoretically digitize, or, you know, you certainly could potentially make virtual reality bullfighting and stuff like that. But there's nothing like the possibly, you know, we talked about this idea of the fool or the hero, right? And the sense of it almost being like, is this kind of like completely barbaric, or is this something that's, you know, barbaric and foolish, or is it like heroic and beautiful? And, you know, something that you bring up with your presentation is like to give a beautiful death, you know, to honor something with a beautiful death, and also to be like, you know, understand your own finitude. Like, in a sense, even if the bullfighter, you know, wins, right, he does, you know, he doesn't end up losing his life, the bull does, right? But in a way, like it's like, who is the hero ultimately in that? You know, in a way, the bull is almost its own form of a hero too, in its own life and its own strength. And there's, I mean, yes, I understand that there can be questions of you know, cruelty, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, though, that there is something that I think what bullfighting predominantly does, and is really important to learn about, is the idea of being artful and respectful in the ability to see death as a type of, there's something strange, wildly sort of performative, in the sense that it's the actual, your skin is literally in the game for that. You're really like, it's on the line. And there's something in bullfighting that is such a radical example of that, you know, and sort of this sort of face-to-faceness with what is, with the other, you know, with the creature, but also seeing that own otherness in yourself, to realize your own brute, you know, brute force, and your own you know, your own sense of all that, what it is to be human, which is the good, you know, the good and the bad, right? And yeah, I just think, to me, I'm wondering, when it comes to bullfighting, is it something that, like, I wonder if it's something that will have a hard time in more digital, technological, you know, sort of time. Do you think that it might make it all the more, and I actually don't know, I haven't really looked this up a lot lately, like in Spanish culture, what's the kind of attitude toward it? Is it seen as like, oh, is it still something that's really honored as like a part of the culture, or is it starting to become something that's under taboo? Like, what, I'm kind of curious on that. But also for you personally, like, why was it that you were gravitated toward bullfighting and incorporating it in your thesis?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was the whole, what it really gravitated, drove my whole sort of like curiosity about it, was this, you know, going through the whole thing of making the film of relating to Picasso, the Minotaur, you know, the going into labyrinth. I was always fascinated by the bull. The bull is something which is, you know, the beast, and transformation into the beast, and the whole, in a way, like Jungian thing of, you know, kind of like going through the, or the dark night of the soul, and all of these things, to go through that passage. So I always saw all of this symbolic kind of language really taking place. And I remember when I was a kid, you know, coming back from school and watching bulls on TV, you know, and they were constantly on TV, and you had all the things, but they were always there. So I don't know, there was something very always fascinating about the zoo, the way they move, especially the wolf there's the kind of like the costumes, there is a sense of elegance and fear, and so I don't know, it kind of like stayed in the back of my head. And then I'm not a pro bullfighter person at all. I'm actually, I really like the bulls, you know. I feel really bad. There is something about me that it feels very unjust sometimes, you know. It's in certain parts of the actual ritualistic performance in a way, which are quite cruel. So I can understand why, you know, it's also very like judgmental thing, and more and more, like if you're asking like how is nowadays in Spain, is becoming less and less. I mean, it's kind of like more in some areas of Spain that is kind of like fading away and disappearing already. A lot of the plazas, a lot of they change them. It's like the churches, you know, they change them into something else. So it's the same thing happening. They're becoming big malls in Barcelona, for example. There's no plaza, bull plaza anymore. Now it's kind of like a big mall. So this whole thing, you know, about the known places, you know, that they are really everything is becoming a known place. And the churches are becoming, you know, discos. You know, and it's fine. It's okay. It's part of, you know, the way we're moving. But for me, really, what really drove me to make this thing about and really related to it, to the whole bullfighting thing, was the interview with the bullfighter himself, which I went to do. I don't even know why. You know, it's just like something that I was exploring, and I was trying to, you know, like see, you know, because we're talking about, you know, the memoirs of the blind, what it is to go through the process of blindness, the darkness of the skin of the bull, you know, that sort of like passage, that confrontation with death, the whole sublimation thing, countering the beast, all of those things were there, and I wanted to explore it, and it was actually the insight of the bullfighter when he actually told me the whole relationship between, you know, the bull and how they are both together. There is a pack, and there is a lot of love between the bullfighters, and how much they you know, they're trying to give the animal a beautiful death in many ways, which is which I got to really respect it so much, and to have this guy in front of you while he's getting changed and he's getting all the clothes, which is a beautiful whole process of wearing them, and telling you, you know, like, okay, these animals that we feed them, we raise them, is part of their life, and then they have to kill them, and sometimes they don't feel like it because they really have a strong connection with the animal. There is a lot of love into what they are doing, and it is true that without the whole fiesta, the whole faena, the whole thing, or the art of bullfighting, these animals would not exist. They will, the toro salvaje, the actual Spanish bull, will not exist because it just wouldn't have fields, wouldn't have, you know, it would be just impossible to maintain or sustain such a beautiful creature to be there. And they would have disappeared. Yes. So and then it's the whole thing about, you know, ethics and aesthetics. You know, like what is the whole thing, you know, like symbolically the whole I mean, Bataille really talks about this a lot in the kind of like when he talks about the sun and writes about Nietzsche and all that. He talks about the figure of the bull a lot, and yeah, it's the whole symbolism is really is a very tantric thing. It's an extremely tantric thing. You know, you have the black vagina sort of like figure, which is the beast, and is actually even though it looks like a vagina, is actually the masculine, and then the body of the bull, which looks more like a Venus in the distance, is actually the feminine, because it's dancing like a. So you have all these sort of like, you know, things, magnetic sort of like games taking place and playing and dancing with each other until one kills the other. So historically comes from the whole Minos culture from all Greece, but then in Spain kind of became like a celebration of life, a celebration of life. And is very rooted in certain certain like south of Spain, still a lot of areas in Madrid. There is a big culture and a lot of people that really loves bulls and bullfighting, but obviously yes, it is becoming a smaller crowd. It's more like a generational thing. Like the younger people does not appreciate it as much and does not want to be, part of. And why as I said, I just went through the whole process and these things start happening and all these connections start taking place, and then the film appeared without me planning it, without just organically the whole thing started unveiling and presenting itself to me, and I just had to dance with it the best way I could. The best way I could. So that's the whole parallel thing. You are there trying to tame this beast, which is the creative thing, which is a project that it kind of like takes over you, and you have to try to make something out of it.
Yeah.
And yes, you go through moments of being very heroic, and through moments of being very idiotic, and it's all part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to try to the same as with the artwork. No, you give the artwork a very beautiful day. Try to give the artwork a very beautiful day, and you also die with it. Yes. So in a way, it's like we're trying to become, even though it's necessary, we're not trying to say that we are creating. If that makes sense. Things are being created, and you are there.
Yeah.
I think that's always important for me. Yes.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's.
And we also have to be able to love what it is that is very difficult for us to deal with, what is deadlier to us. I think that's also, I don't know, important to be able to tame the beast. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, that was wonderful. It's beautiful, Jorge. I love that so much. Thank you so much for going more into that and explaining more. Really love that. And I honestly I could keep speaking with you for much longer, but I think we'll probably wrap it up now, since I know it's getting late your side, 12-hour difference. So but I really appreciate you talking with me, Jorge, and I already have like my little notes and more questions for you. I hope we can maybe have another conversation another time.
Oh, please, I would love to.
I would love that too. And I learned so much. I really did. And it's truly like very formative for my own, mediation process and conceptualization process for my own life and the things that we all will encounter as humans. So I appreciate you and what you do. And thank you for helping me in my own process. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me. And thank you for all your insightful, and beautiful questions and suggestions and your insight in the whole thing. I also learned about, that's for sure. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And congratulations always in your whole wonderful podcast and everything that you guys do. I'm a fan.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Always whenever you want. Yes. Okay. That's for sure.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming on again, and we're so happy to have you. And again, hope you have a wonderful evening, and thank you for your time, and thank you for what you do.